All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Fiona Lewis, and I'm the Patient Support Liaison for AMAC. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. AMAC is a leading funder of research into bone marrow failure diseases in Canada, and we support patient caregivers across the country who are living with aplastic anemia, myelodysplastic syndrome, and PNH. In the past year, we've hosted a number of regional in-person patient education meetings, and we're going to continue with these into 2025. And we also continue to offer monthly patient support meetings via Zoom. So you can check out our website to register for any of these meetings and access a lot of other resources we have there. So your line will be muted during today's presentation, but you can type any questions you have into the Q&A feature, which you should be able to see by hovering your mouse at the bottom of your screen. And if there's time at the end, I will also unmute the lines and you can ask your question verbally if you like. So please note that today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our website within about a week. So I'm pleased to introduce Anika Dhalla to present today's webinar regarding nutrition for your energy and health. Anika is a registered dietitian who specializes in chronic conditions like diabetes, hypertension, and much more. As a dietitian, Anika is able to support her clients with developing a healthy relationship with food through the life cycle. Her ultimate goal is to have her clients feel supported in their journey with food and nutrition, while also considering changes that may occur in the future. So welcome, Anika, and I'll let you begin the webinar.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Fiona. So thank you for that lovely introduction. So this is me, because you can't see me on the camera. So this is, I do focus with chronic disease management. I have expertise, obviously, in a private practice. I also have worked in home care, and I actively work in long-term care settings as well. So I have a really vast knowledge of all sorts of different types of folks from all sorts of lifestyles. And nutrition in the life cycle is something that I'm very passionate about, and especially in older populations. I look at nutrition support and prevention of chronic diseases. So whether someone is managing a current chronic condition or they are looking to prevent that chronic condition from maybe happening at an earlier onset, that's something that I love working with my clients with. Now, as Fiona mentioned, the relationship that we have with food is something I'm going to touch on today as well, just because it is a very important piece of this. We can only talk about diets and exercise and all the stuff we read online, but that doesn't change our relationship. It shouldn't change our relationship with food. And that's something that I'm very passionate about dealing with all of my clients. So the objectives for today are to broaden our understanding. Sorry?
If I could just interrupt, it looks like your slides are being cut off on the
Oh,
left side.
is that better?
Ah, yes.
Yes. Sorry. I'm so sorry about that.
Okay, thank you.
So sorry. Here, I'll go back so then everybody can see that. That's me, and that's what I specialize in. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Awesome. Technical difficulties, right? So the objectives are for today are to broaden the understanding of nutrition's role in chronic bone conditions, something that all of us are sort of dealing with, especially within this community of AMAC, to better understand health and how nutrition can impact our longevity and overall energy. Those are the main objectives for today. So some chronic bone diseases, obviously osteoporosis, which I think everyone has likely heard about. I gave a really good sort of indication of what it looks like. Aplastic anemia, which is the double A in our AMAC, and then myelodysplastic syndromes, and paroxysmal nocturnal hypoglobulinemia. My brother's a doctor, and I really did try to ask him to make me pronounce that properly. I'm so sorry, but we're going to call them AA, MDS, and PNH. These chronic conditions do play a role in how we sort of have to manage them. Obviously, we're going to look at osteoporosis primarily just because it is something that many people will benefit from. And then our AMAC community is able to really look at those recommendations and also utilize them as well. And there. So nutrition's role. This is like the macronutrients, right? That we always talk about. You've got your protein, your healthy fats, carbohydrates, and fiber. Now, fiber and carbohydrates, they go hand in hand because fiber is a type of carb. But it is an individual that I'm going to really stress on as we kind of work on it together today as we talk about it. So let's kind of just dive into this, and let's start with protein. So protein plays an important role when we look at our overall health and wellness. Proteins also help in muscle development as well as cell development and overall tissue development. So when we're talking about bone conditions, protein does help with sort of making sure that the outer parts of bones actually are able to be protected, right? Because that muscle tissue is where bone diseases, they're not able to really manage themselves if they don't have the kind of baseline of that protection that's around them. That's the muscle tissue. Proteins have the ability to utilize excess carbohydrates when we consume them. So what that means is that protein needs energy in order for it to be usable muscle development. Kind of different than what we're hearing on the internet, right? Most people say, oh, have less carbs, have less carbs. But when we do intake carbohydrates, protein actually becomes more efficient in the utilization of muscle development. So that's why we should be pairing these things. And we'll talk about balance as we sort of talk about like throughout the day today. When we're consuming proteins in our body, it requires, specific amounts of protein in order to be in that optimal functional sort of space. Protein also helps with metabolic function. So our body uses protein to allow for our body to metabolize various things like glucose, which is sugar, saturated fat, and other toxins within our body. It does support that strong immune system in some various sources, obviously listed in this picture here, but just for your own knowledge, chicken, beef, fish, eggs, beans, lentils, nuts, nut butters, even soy products like tempeh, tofu, edamame beans, they all have protein in them. So protein comes in so many different sort of shapes and sizes. Even some like products like rice will have some protein in it. Vegetables do have small amounts of protein, but the saturation and bioavailability of those things are going to be a little bit less than, say, something like a soy product or lentil or meat specifically. Oops. There we go. So let's talk about healthy fats. So healthy fats can be a whole kind of topic in itself. When we're looking at fat, we want to look at certain kind of blood markers to really know, are we eating the right kinds of fats? So the thing that we're going to look for is your HDL, your happy cholesterol. And those happy cholesterols come from things that are unsaturated. So those are your PUFAs. Those are your omega fatty acids. And omega fatty acids are it's a buzzword, right? And it's something that we hear on a regular basis, contains omega fatty acids. Now, when we're having those polyunsaturated fats, I'm going to call them PUFAs, this will help to lower your lousy cholesterol or your LDL cholesterol, if you've ever seen that marker in your blood work. And that's because of the amount of saturation that's there. Now, when you're intaking those HDL cholesterols, those PUFAs, we're going to help with overall brain functioning, and that's because our brain actually is fat, right? So when we pull in the unsaturated fat, it actually helps the brain to sort of access a little bit better. Now, things like when we're taking in that fat, it also helps to use fats like HGIA class, which also was looking into the brain and optimal functioning, and helps with our decision making and memory. It's a really great way of looking at even prevention of memory loss, like Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and its early onset. So making sure that we have those healthy fats on a regular basis actually can look into that prevention piece of early onset of these conditions. Now, some really good examples. We've got things like salmon, tuna, olive oil, avocado, nuts, avocado oil, even pesto sauce, because we're going to make it with olive oil. And actually, canola oil is actually a great source of your PUFAs as well. So it really just depends on your price point. Avocado oil is a great option for cooking, and it's equally as good to canola. It's just the price point is very different. So if we're, on a budget, using canola oil is a great option just because it's got all the things we need, and does have those omega fatty acids that say something that's a lot more expensive as an olive oil would. All right, let's talk about carbs. Some people call them the devil, and I don't, because I love them. And I do think that there's a lot of value to them. They're frequently demonized to be this negative thing that we need to avoid, but ultimately our body's most effective source of energy is actually carbohydrates. So when we look at carbs as a part of our body and that efficient source, you can see our hormone response is improving. So if we're not intaking a lot of carbs, we tend to, get really tired, and that changes our hormones. So really looking at overall fullness as well, that's a part of a hormonal response. So if we're not feeling full, we tend to crave carbs, right? Like a sugar craving or, like a starchy craving. Those things come from the idea of not being able to consume enough carbohydrates through the day. Now, they also bring in a different part of food, and that's the enjoyment factor. The enjoyment factor is where we see our mental health and our food and our like sustenance piece of health sort of come into play. Our mental health plays a really big role in our energy. If we're not enjoying the foods that we're eating, our mental health goes down and our mood goes down. So actually looking at how can we incorporate carbohydrates and still have the energy, still have enjoyment. So looking at things that have carbohydrates, but maybe they have what we're going to talk about, fiber in them as well. So great examples: fruits, vegetables, grain products. That's really my favorite types of carbs. Lentils are a great source of carbohydrates as well. So those are what we call complex carbohydrates because they do have carbs, protein, fiber. Having that complexity allows for, again, optimal functioning of our bodies. So let's talk about my friend fiber. This is my favorite thing, and a lot of my colleagues and friends, they all make fun of me because I'm always talking about poop, but we're going to talk about it a little bit. So fiber provides a couple of things in terms of our overall functioning, from the idea of like our bowel movements functioning properly, our like blood sugar functioning properly. Fiber is actually going to help do that. And it's really a place where intaking fiber can help to lower your blood sugar. And how it does that is that it picks up excess things along the way because we don't absorb fiber. So it's going to pick up things like excess glucose, excess LDL cholesterol, and that's your lousy cholesterol, right? And if it's not going to be used by our body, fiber is going to be like, hey, I'm going to take this to the toilet, literally. And then our body's able to sort of move it out, and it can actually, again, decrease that overall risk of type 2 diabetes if we're taking an adequate amount of fiber in. It can also decrease, again, that LDL values because it decreases the amount of saturated fat that is being brought into the bloodstream, which overall can decrease rising blood pressures and the risk of cardiovascular disease. So fiber is one of my, again, favorite things. Women tend to need about 25 to 30 grams per day, and men need a lot more. They're going to need about 35 to 40 grams per day. And half of Canadians don't actually reach half of those requirements. So when you don't give your body enough, you kind of run on the idea that we're going to have weird poops, because fiber is a bulking and a moving agent. So it's going to bulk up your stool. It's also going to help to move your stool. So there's those two different types of fiber. There's the soluble and there's insoluble fiber. Your soluble fiber is going to be stuff that absorbs water. So things like your oats, rice, those things that rehydrate them, they absorb water. And when we're looking at things like raw vegetables, that's your insoluble fiber, right? When we put that in water, nothing really happens to it. Now, if we were to cut up, say, a stick of celery and cut it up really fine and put it into water, it's going to start to become soft. So that's absorbing water. So even cooked vegetables have both proponents of fiber. And that is where we want to see our gut being very happy, our energy levels going up, and our overall satiety, our fullness being managed as well. Now we can also call fiber uh, produce, right? So when we're looking at a meal, how do we actually create a balanced meal? And it's really like, let's add some produce in this. And now we've added fiber. Now, those recommendations I gave you with the 25 to 30 and the 35 to 40, the reason why men is going to be a little bit higher is because typically, and again, like this is going to depend on size, shape, and like age of a person. As we get older, we tend to need less fiber, and men tend to need more because they are at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And that's primarily why that recommendation exists. Now, don't just jump in to the pool of eating an excessive amount of fiber because that may be an excess for you, right? Again, because only half of Canadians reach half of those requirements. So if you're getting about 12 grams of fiber in a day, my expectation is for never to jump into a 25 gram of fiber per day. And the reason is because you will likely get bunged up. So we got to start slow and let your body adjust and make sure you're hydrating in that process, because remember that solubility and insolubility. If something is soluble, it's going to need that water to get it moving out of you. And really, fiber, because it's produce, you can't forget about that taste factor. That's the enjoyment piece of it, right? We have to make sure that things taste good. Otherwise, it's just going to taste like we're always eating vegetables, and it gets really boring really quick. So looking at, adding fiber into foods that maybe you're already eating. So for example, you really like to have rice with chicken. Maybe you're going to add some frozen vegetables to your rice. Now you've added a fiber proponent to that meal, and you're still having pretty much the same meal. So looking at how we can make foods that we currently use and just not having to reinvent the wheel of being like, okay, well, now I have to suddenly eat salads, and you may not like salads. So really looking at how we can slowly add those things in to make it usable and accessible for us. Now, let's just talk about hydration a little bit. Fueling our body with food is very important, but hydration plays a very crucial role. I always tell people if you're thirsty, you probably are already dehydrated. And that's why it really matters, because 3% dehydration of your body is shown to have 10% decline in performance. So that's your energy levels. If you are dehydrated, you are likely going to have lower energy levels. Low levels of hydration can impair the body's ability to regulate heating, heart rate, body temperature. It increases the perceived exertion. So that can like result in a quicker onset of fatigue. So it kind of like makes you feel more tired essentially. And that can make you feel more tired. Like that's where like kind of feel tired, even though you may have gotten a full night's sleep and you may have eaten well. But if you're dehydrated, you may still have that decrease in mental function. And it affects the ability to play smart in different activities, right? So say you're a very active person. If you're not drinking enough water and hydrating yourself, you actually may not actually feel the effects of that activity to the best of its ability. It also decreases the gastric emptying, right? And that's where that soluble, insoluble fiber also comes into play. So if you're experiencing a lot of bloating, water actually does help in those situations. So this is like a nice kind of way of looking at your urine. It's like a nice little gradient. So it shows that the darker the urine tends to be, it's an indicator of dehydration. So we don't want something that's very, very green, like in that kind of ochre color. We want to have more of that light, almost clear urine to really show us, hey, I'm actually not dehydrated. And of course, this is always not the case because medications can influence this. Sometimes things that you eat can influence this. Like if you're eating a lot of beets, sometimes you can get a little bit red in your urine. If you have different chronic conditions, sometimes depending on where you're at in stages of your chronic condition, this can change as well. But this is a general marker when we're looking at fluids and your levels of hydration. Now, signs of dehydration to sort of watch for are things like headaches, poor concentration, early fatigue, muscle cramping, dizziness. Those are things to show us that can really indicate I'm dehydrated. So, my suggestion is just keep a bottle of water with you. And if you don't want to do that, you can also keep a jug on your desk if you work from home, or you can bring one of those really big jugs and like get a little mug and sort of drink out of it. You can also have things like tea or uncaffeinated tea, or maybe you really like to have a straw with you so you can actually drink from a straw. So there's different strategies that we can bring this into play to have an adequate amount of water to ensure we're not dehydrated. All right, so let's put this all together, right? Like we talked enough about all those macronutrients, but now let's fit it all together. So obviously this is Canada's food guide, which I'm sure everyone has seen, but let's look at how we're sort of balancing this out and why, right? Now that we've talked about, okay, if we're bringing in protein, we're bringing in carbohydrates, we also are bringing in that half of your plate being fiber. Now, another way to look at this is also looking at your hands, right? So, two hands is typically half a plate, and that should be where your vegetables are at. One fist is looking at, how much carb you should have, and maybe your palm of your hand is where your protein's at. Now, this is a good way to indicate because everybody's hands are different. I'm a very small, like I'm only 5 feet tall, so I have really small hands. So my portions are going to be completely different than someone else who may be a much larger person than me. So looking at that, everybody's portions are going to be different. And I know I experienced that many times with a lot of my clients is that question, what's the portion size I should be eating? And that's really looking at just something as simple as your hands. And again, using the plate method where we get a quarter and a half, that's another way of looking at it as well. This is a very literal representation of this, right? We don't have to just have just a salad on the side. Remember when I talked about sort of mixing in vegetables into maybe some rice, maybe you're having chicken with that, and maybe you're having another vegetable kind of on the side as well. That would be half your plate being vegetables, right? It doesn't have to just be a salad. It doesn't just have to be roasted veggies that's half your plate. It can look like so many different things. When we're looking at proteins, looking at those plant-based options is also very important. There is a lot of recent research that shows that protein sources coming from soy products actually does help with various bone conditions like osteoporosis, and that's likely because of the calcium levels that are in those products. Now, when we look at that basic plate, I don't know about you, but it looks kind of boring. We're seeing, just that little bit of toast, some noodles, and then we go up to the proteins and everything's really small. And then all this like array of vegetables. Like who eats strawberries and peppers and cabbage together with like peas? And it just looks like such a random array of things. But a way that you can also put it together is maybe we're going to do like a burrito. right? Maybe we're going to do a grilled chicken with veggies on a whole grain tortilla. Now, all of a sudden, that's half your plate. And maybe we put a little bit of avocado or salsa on there. We've got a little bit more to add into it for that enjoyment factor, but we're adding in vegetables at the same time. So you can see that foods that you may enjoy actually may be very balanced, or they can be adjusted just slightly. So then they have that balance to give you that energy. Having all of these different types of food groups in there can actually ensure that you're meeting your macro and micronutrient requirements. And that can actually help you to not have to be on so many supplements either. I find that a lot of folks are on many different types of supplements because they're not really sure as to which supplements they need to be on. And really, if we're having a balanced diet, we may not need everything. There are a couple ones that I am going to recommend that we should sort of make sure we're having. Again, talk to your physician as well. And this is individual based. It all depends on what your blood work looks like as well. Okay, so why does it matter? I think I sort of touched on this already, but really having balance allows for our body to be working as a well-oiled machine, right? We run as this well-oiled machine. Everything sort of works together to make our body work better. So like whether if we're not eating something right, our gut responds, and then our pancreas responds, and then our bowels respond again, and our liver responds, and that respond, like all of the organs work together when we do things that aren't balanced. So that's a place where keeping a well-oiled machine allows for our energy levels to actually be more efficient. When we're having an adequate amount of protein and fiber, again, that fullness factor comes into play. We feel full, and that impacts our gut, that impacts our hormonal response, that also impacts things like, our overall happiness because we're enjoying it. We feel full. We're not starving, hangry, and upset. I think that's the biggest one. Many people will like not eat for a very long time and they get really angry. And that's likely because they're not feeling that fullness factor, and those hormones are coming into play and impacting other hormones to sort of like give out that rage to you. Now, I'm going to go through some micronutrients, as I mentioned, and that's looking at, again, generalized recommendations. These are not for everyone. If you do want like very personalized things, I would actually personally see a dietitian or talk to your physician on what you need based on your blood sugar or your blood tests, okay? Now, the gut-brain connection is also something that I sort of have been touching on a little bit while we've been talking today, and it's important to recognize that. So that's that communication between your gut bacteria and your brain. Those neural pathways within your gut are going to communicate with your brain, and that impacts the hormonal response, and that can actually improve your overall gut microbiota, and it helps with de-stressing. So when we're looking at things like comfort, when we're really comfortable, when we're like happy, we tend to not have that hunger factor. But say we're really stressed, our brain reacts and tells us, hey, I'm needing something to give me comfort. And a lot of this comes from when we were very young. When our parents, when I'm sure this may have happened to you, where you've done something really good and you get a sweet treat at the end of it. Now we've built in this response to tell us, okay, when we seek comfort, when we seek reward, we go for something sweet. Now that's what we've learned over time, and that's because of like the way that we've been brought up, and that's pretty universal throughout culture and different socioeconomic status. It all depends, but it is something that is very common in many different cultures and families. So looking at that, we've now added in comfort into the mix. So someone's feeling like, I need comfort, I need comfort. Our brain may react in telling our gut, hey, you know what gives them comfort? Something sweet. Have sweets. And then you end up craving those things. Now, looking at it from the perspective of your gut response, it also may be because you're not eating enough, right? We talked about that fullness factor, the hormonal response with that. So you can see how it's cycling through from your gut to your brain, to your gut, to your brain, and the cycle continues. So understanding where you're at in terms of your hunger can help with that gut-brain connection. And that actually, there's a lot of emerging research that shows the improvement in brain function when our gut is happy, and the improvement in gut health when our brain is happy. Okay, let's talk micronutrients. So these are some like key ones that I do like to talk about when we're talking about good bone health. We've got calcium, magnesium, vitamin D, and vitamin K. So all of these things, they are found in many different examples, and I'm just going to show you a couple slides here that are really helpful. So when we're looking at calcium-containing foods, calcium is we can find calcium in like an intricately regulated in our body to maintain sort of that serum level through that hormonal and metabolic process. And it helps to stimulate things like your parathyroid hormone, and it actually helps with the absorption of vitamin D. And for proper bone sort of remodeling, depending again on your chronic condition, adequate calcium is required. So when there's an insufficient supply of calcium in the diet, the body maintains sort of a place of calcium by reabsorbing bone tissue. So ensuring that we have an adequate amount of calcium comes from products like these. So this is a great little, this is a great little sort of way of looking at calcium, because you can see it's in so many different things. This sort of snippet is from Dietitian Success Center. They have great handouts. I'm sure if you ever see a dietitian, they would have access to this. It's just a really nice way of sort of looking at different places of calcium. And there's obviously other dairy-free options, and going for, fortification, that like things that actually have calcium added to it, is also beneficial. Getting calcium supplementation through an actual physical pill or supplement is also an option, but again, depends on where your calcium serum levels are at in your blood work. Okay, so magnesium is also something that I feel like in the last couple of years has become quite a buzz micronutrient, and approximately 60% of the body's magnesium is actually stored in the bones. And magnesium directly affects bone quality by reducing the size of mineral crystals and making bone less brittle. Similar to calcium deficiency, though, a deficiency of magnesium can actually impair bone growth and weaken bones, and that can actually disrupt calcium metabolism. So we need magnesium to ensure that calcium is metabolized properly. But magnesium deficiency is also very, very rare, but it could be happening with you if you are experiencing any of the chronic bone conditions that we discussed earlier, and within the AMAC community. Clinical research has shown that magnesium intake is linked to better bone metabolic density and reduced bone turnover, especially in menopausal and postmenopausal women. However, some of the research is also showing that magnesium and bone health is observational, so that relationship with magnesium intake and fracture risk is actually kind of unclear. So just being very transparent, magnesium is something that is very helpful for things like calcium metabolism in our bone, but the research around it is not super clear if it's necessary in that prevention piece. I like to include it because it's actually incorporated in so many different foods, and it does help with sort of that relaxation piece that can give us some energy. Also, magnesium helps with sort of, again, that relaxation of muscle. So if we're looking at something like a person who may be constipated. Again, I told you I was talking about foods or poop, kind of the same thing. Just depends on what hole is going out of and in. But say someone is very constipated, actually taking in magnesium-rich foods or having magnesium supplementation can help them sort of go to the bathroom very comfortably. Again, magnesium is something that we can get in so many different things. These are just some examples. Again, this sort of snippet is from Dietitian Success Center. There we go. Okay, so vitamin D. Vitamin D helps maintain things like our calcium and our phosphate levels, and it overall promotes calcium in the gut. Vitamin D is something that we in Canada have a little bit of trouble getting just because it's currently dark outside where I'm at. It's 7 o'clock and it is pitch dark. So sunlight is the primary sort of natural source of vitamin D. And the second sort of line of defense for vitamin D is that supplementation. That's how we're going to ensure that we get enough vitamin D in the day, especially here living in Canada. Now, the amount of vitamin D is very dependent on the individual, whether it's their chronic condition, whether it's their gender, whether it's their race. There are many different factors into the actual amount of supplementation that we should be providing. Osteoporosis Canada and a lot of new osteoporosis research says a minimum of 400 IUs. So it's a baby dose of it. Being South Asian myself, South Asians tend to need a little bit more vitamin D, and that's because we do have things like iron deficiency. We tend to have, diabetes that is very rampant in our communities. So actually, vitamin D does help to regulate some of those hormones that can affect things like diabetes and hypertension. Wild salmon actually has about 400 IUs in it as well. Now, cod liver oil as well. Like if you're going to be taking the cod liver oil, you're also going to be getting those omega fatty acids that we talked about as well. There has been some research about wild mushrooms. I do recommend talking to someone very experienced when harvesting wild mushrooms. Don't go out and do it unless you actually know what you're doing, because it can seriously hurt you and kill you if you're not doing it properly. Eggs have a little bit of vitamin D. There is also fortified eggs, which I do recommend if that's within your price point, because then you're getting a little bit of extra vitamin D. If you're drinking milk, milk is also fortified with vitamin D. Now, vitamin K it helps with the formation and activation of proteins that helps to strengthen and build bones. It ensures that these proteins like osteocalcine and other types of proteins are able to bind to calcium for bone density and strength. Without adequate vitamin K, bones can become weak and more prone to fractures. Now, as you can see, I don't usually recommend supplements, and the reason is because I want food to be the first source. There's two types of vitamin K. There's vitamin K1 and vitamin K2. Now, these are so many different options, but we're seeing more of that plant-based situation in the K1. So making sure that we pair it with, maybe you're going to have those calcium containing products with vitamin K containing products. So maybe you're having some tofu with some spinach. And now all of a sudden you're getting vitamin K and vitamin C together to help with the overall absorption. So, and say you eat meat, you're already there, right? You're going to have a chicken breast, you're already meeting those vitamin K requirements for the day. So the recommendations in terms of supplementation, again, really talk to your healthcare provider. And this is something that I do strongly recommend. Don't just go out and buy supplements unless you really know why and what your blood work is looking like, because there's so many different things and we don't want to be harmful and not helpful. So really talk to your healthcare provider, look at your blood work, have that analyzed in order to know what kind of supplementation you need. Omega fatty acids, very hard to overdose on them. So if you're taking them, if you like taking them, it's not a big deal. So there's a couple of things like that you're able to sort of take, and it's not going to harm you in that sense. Taking an excess of calcium, again, depending on your condition, depending on your blood work, excess amounts of calcium, as we learned, can do more harm than good. Vitamin D, very difficult to overdose on, but again, if you're immunocompromised, this is a place where your kidneys can overload and different things can sort of start happening. So again, making sure that you're taking an adequate amount of vitamin D for you as an individual is very important. There's other micronutrients to consider as well, things like vitamin A, vitamin C. Again, vitamin C, very difficult to overdose on because it's literally just juice essentially. Potassium, folate, B12, and other prebiotic foods, so things that have a lot of fiber. Again, that's how we're going to get those sort of trace minerals as well in order to have that optimized functioning for our bones. Okay, so let's talk about intentional movement. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what is intentional. So intentional means that you're doing it for you and that you're doing it with purpose. So some people are really rah and they like go to the gym and they love it and they like go to yoga classes or spin classes. That is a form of intentional movement. Other folks, maybe they're like, I like to go for a walk every single day. That is an intentional way of moving. Not to call out one of my clients, but I'll never forget her because she has a 3-story townhouse and would vacuum her stairs every single day and say, that's my workout for the day. So she was intentionally cleaning her house, but also moving her body to clean her house. So that was a place of intentional movement that was very taxing on her, and really looking at what movement works for you. So really what I'm talking about when it comes to intentional movement is showing that increase in heart rate for about 30 minutes and seeing it sort of go down and seeing it go up and down. And that helps with the decrease in the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, the recommendation is to do at least 2 days of strength training a week. So if you're walking every day, take 2 of those days and maybe do something that is a little bit more related to strength and using musculature that may not just be walking. So whether it's lifting light weights, gardening, not really right now, but maybe you're raking the lawn. That's another place to sort of go for that. So really looking at how we can build strength. And it doesn't just have to be, I have to go to the gym. There's other ways we can do that. So let's look at that optimizing energies, just summarizing it a little bit. So balancing meals is number one in giving our body that ability to process macro and micronutrients to optimize our metabolism. As we age, our body has some trouble processing foods that aren't really balanced. So then we see, bowel movements being weird and maybe something like, constipation, or maybe you're having frequent loose stools. It's very common as we age to have this bloating. Those things all sort of happen because we're not having those balanced meals. And sometimes it's because we don't got the time. So kind of creating simple ways to make time, whether you're using frozen vegetables, grabbing an apple to go, these are ways that we can sort of help oil that simple machine that our body is. The wear and tear of this machine can take its toll, and if we don't have those balanced meals, we can see that sort of metabolic rate going down in older populations. De-stressing with enjoyment. So whether it's like doing something intentional, like movement, whether it's intentional, like you're having very intentional conversations, excuse me, that hormonal response to stress is how we metabolize food, that gut-brain connection. So really looking at how do we de-stress in environments that are very stressful? So maybe the kitchen is a very stressful place. Taking the time, maybe we're going to set ourselves up for success. We're going to put a placemat down. We're going to set ourselves up. Maybe you face away from the kitchen when you eat, so then you don't have to look at the mess and get stressed out. So those are ways to sort of mitigate and manage the stress that can help with that overall metabolism and decreasing that hormonal response of stress. So in summary, nutrition's role is looking at those macronutrients, protein, healthy fats, and carbohydrates / fiber, and hydration and how important it is to optimize energy. You're not drinking enough water, you're probably going to feel tired. That's the bottom line. Balancing meals and some of those micronutrients I talked about as well. And what is intentional movement? Also looking at how that can optimize energy. And that's pretty much it for me. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. That's my name and that's my website. And then I also have an Instagram handle that's pesky veggies, which I just realized is a typo. So you can also find me just on my website, and I'll see you there.
Great. Thank you, Anika. So I'll just remind everybody, you can type a question into the Q&A there, or you can raise your hand if you'd like me to unmute you, and you could just ask your question out loud. Maybe while people are thinking about that, Anika, I'll just ask you one of my questions,
Sure.
which is what do you think about a lot of the ready-made meals that are now available through places like Fresh Prep, or even some of the delivery services, meal delivery services for seniors? Are
Mhm.
they good options for people who are, feeling a lot of fatigue and don't have time or energy to make their own meals?
So like things like Fresh Prep, in Ontario, we have Meals on Wheels. These are great options because we do tend to make them balanced. I know that there's one that's actually out that's not just like targeted towards older adults. It's called a Factor, and that's pretty much the same as Meals on Wheels, except at a much higher price point, at least here in Ontario. So I love them because they do allow for that ease. Again, the meal delivery is going to be a lot fresher versus the ones that you microwave. Those ones tend to have a lot of additives and, again, that saturated fat versus the ones that are made fresh from a delivery service. Those ones tend to be a little bit less saturated fat. So what I like to do with those meals as well is, like, if you're like, I don't want to make food, also looking at things that, like, because you have to put in the microwave anyways, we can also add things like frozen vegetables to those meals to provide that fiber to manage the saturated fat as well. So, like, say that it's like a meat and potatoes kind of meal, which again is very common in a lot of those kind of prepped foods. You can always throw in a little bit of frozen broccoli, and you're throwing it in the microwave all together anyways. The lid's going to be on it. It'll steam in there. Super easy.
Right, good idea.
Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, perfect.
Um, I'll keep going because I don't see any others popping up yet. Um, in general, how do people engage a dietitian for a personal consultation? And is that a funded service in most provinces, do you know, or would people have to pay to have a dietitian meet with them?
So typically it is not funded, unless the dietitian works out of a community health center, and those lists are very, very long. For myself as a dietitian, I'm able to see people from all over the place, primarily because they have coverage from like their own insurance companies, whether it's from work. I do see some folks through like a sort of referral service that's done like through an occupational therapist. They'll refer to me, and then those individuals don't pay anything, but the occupational therapist sort of pays me. So it depends on the avenue that you're going through. It's really dependent on the person's coverage and ability. A dietitian can be costly, but we do have a lot of breadth of knowledge that comes with it and a lot of expertise. I wish that there was a way to have it publicly funded. Again, community health centers are really where you're going to see that public funding. Diabetes clinics is where we're going to see that public funding. But if you're seeing me just for, not just, but for your particular chronic condition that isn't diabetes related, it tends to come out of pocket or through insurance.
And do most people in that circumstance just have one session with you, or does it usually take a few to kind of change?
Um, Typically, I see folks in 1 to 3 sessions, like if that's all they can afford. And if I ask them like, what's kind of your budget for it, I'm very much, my goal is to always meet people where they're at, because then I'm able to see that variety of folk and also be able to help more people. And that's again my number one goal, is to help people build a relationship with food that's very positive, and money can always get in the way of that. So I like to meet people where they're at for sure.
And if someone's advertising their services as a nutritionist, are they, does that mean they're a registered dietitian or not necessarily?
Absolutely not. Sorry to be very blunt about that. A registered dietitian is not the same as a nutritionist. A nutritionist, they can sometimes do minor courses in not even a university, but like through other organizations that aren't regulated. So the real kind of kick of it is that they're not a regulated body. Whereas I have a regulatory college, I also have a regulatory sort of Canadian sort of place that I have to go to report myself and tell them what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, versus a nutritionist who may not have any regulation. So that's why they can charge up the roof. They can sort of make recommendations based on TikToks and Instagram reels and Facebook reels. So that recommendation comes from a not evidence-based place. It can get confusing because in the US, a dietitian's designation is actually a registered dietitian nutritionist. So it gets a little confusing when you see perhaps a nutritionist or a dietitian in the US because they may actually be a dietitian as well. In different provinces, some dietitians will also go by RDN, like Saskatchewan, they'll actually go by RDN. It really just depends. I know it's not concrete answer, but really checking if they have the credentials, if they're registered with a college. We all have registration numbers that are followed, and those things you can literally type in my registration number and see exactly who I am, where I went to school, what kind of credentials I have, and why I have those things. So having that sort of trace back really is accountability ultimately.
Yeah, that's good to know because there's so much information and misinformation out there about food and supplements for sure.
Yes, and even just the knowledge breadth, right? So like I went to school for a long time. I have 2 degrees, one of them in biology, one of them in nutritional sciences. And then I also did a comprehensive competitive internship at the hospitals. Nutritionists, like I could go get their certificate online and give it to you. And that's the extent of it. Really, if you have any nutrition training, you can say, hey, I like you did like a nutrition course in university, you can call yourself a nutritionist. So regulation is really where that comes into play. And that's to protect our patients, right? Like from
Yeah,
getting not evidence-based approaches.
yeah, yeah. So we do have a comment. Someone just said, great session and thank you for sharing about fiber taking food to the toilet. Never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I'm glad. Fiber is my favorite thing. I always talk about poop to the point where people make fun of me, but it's everybody poops. And if you're not pooping, it's a problem. If you're pooping too much, it's also a problem.
And I like your LDL cholesterol being lousy cholesterol. That's
Yeah.
good because I always have trouble remembering those when I see my own
Yeah, it's your
blood work.
happy and your lousy. So it makes it a little easier to remember which one's a good cholesterol. It's the happy and the lousy.
Yeah, that's great. Good
Yeah.
statement.
Good tip, right? When you have to look at your own blood work.
Yes. Um, all right. Any other questions there? I don't see any. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Anika, for that information, and I love your slides.
Thank you.
Are you able to share your slides with us as well?
I can. I'll send them to Cindy or Maria if that's okay, because
Sure.
they have all my
Yeah.
contact information. So I'll share that with them just because I know that there's some technical difficulties in the recording. So I'm sure they might want to backlog it and make sure that it's done properly on the recording end.
Yeah, and there's some good information in the slides about amounts of nutrients in different foods, so that's
Yes,
great.
yes, those handouts are great. Again, I wouldn't have them without Dietitian Success Center, so I really do appreciate their contribution to this.
Great. And I'll just make a plug for another webinar we're having tomorrow, which is about understanding your lab results. So we have a doctor speaking then at 4 p.m. Atlantic time. So that's a good place to ask questions too about how you can look at your blood work from a nutritional perspective and see how you're doing.
Yes, definitely. And again, I usually go through a lot of that with my clients too, is going through their blood work, because not a lot of times when you go through it, your doctor's like, yep, everything looks good. And you're like, I don't know what it means though. So
Yeah, yeah.
having that experience can be really helpful.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And please do check our website for news about upcoming meetings and registration information. And we'll soon be publishing our winter newsletter. So if you haven't signed up to receive that, you can do that as well on the website. So thanks again, everybody. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.